Welcome to today's Explainer. I recently came across a piece of history that honestly sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel, but it is entirely real. We are talking about a totally unique, completely bloodless revolution that actually defeated an empire. Just imagine for a second standing up to one of the most heavily armed superpowers in human history, not with guns, not with tanks, but literally with music. Well, that is exactly what happened during the Baltic singing revolution. Okay, let's dive into this with a quote that really sets the emotional core of our story. Back in 1988, the Estonian artist Heinz Valk wrote, "A nation who makes its revolution by singing and smiling should be a sublime example to all." And that editorial right there, that's what gave the entire movement its name, the Singing Revolution. Volk was basically pointing out that the riots, the barricades, the burning cars you usually see in mass revolts, that just wasn't their style. They found a completely different path. And to figure out exactly how they pulled off this massive feat, we're relying on a truly incredible piece of source material. It's an academic deep dive by Guntis Šmidchens called The Power of Song. It breaks down exactly how the nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania managed to weaponize their own cultural heritage to win their political freedom. It's a fascinating read. Section 1. A Decade of Freedom. July 4th, 1998, Washington, D.C. So picture the scene. We're at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in D.C. The main stage is absolutely packed. 150 Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians walk out carrying their national flags. Imagine the vibrant, piercing sounds of Latvian bagpipes and Lithuanian shepherd's horns just cutting right through this thunderous applause from the American audience. They were there celebrating a decade since their victory, showing the whole world exactly how they sang their way to freedom. Section 2. The Singing Revolution, David versus Goliath. But how did they get to that celebration? Well, we have to flash back to the grim reality of Soviet occupation. Estonian ethnomusicologist Ingrid Rutel framed this conflict perfectly. It was the ultimate David and Goliath story. The Soviet Union was Goliath, asserting itself with sheer terrifying military might. The Baltic states, they were David. And as Rutel points out, a small nation needs the wisdom and cleverness of David to survive. Living under foreign rule, they developed this brilliant strategy: external adaptation, but internal survival. Since they couldn't just shoot their way out, they leaned entirely on nonviolence and song. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the singing revolution wasn't just a single concert. It was a rapid, explosive chain reaction. Starting in 1987, everyday citizens courageously started breaking through Soviet restrictions on free speech. By 1988, those small protests snowballed into massive popular fronts. That momentum just kept building until the spring of 1990, when they established civilian-based defense and declared independence. And finally, by August 1991, they achieved full, recognized diplomatic independence. Let's zoom in on Estonia for a second to see what this mobilization actually looked like on the ground. It started with a movement to protect their heritage, which quickly evolved into demonstrations in Herva Park, where dissidents were boldly demanding independence. Then came the massive Song of Estonia festival. But the craziest part was the defense of Dom Hill. An opposing faction actually attacked the Estonian government building, and a massive crowd of Estonians showed up. But they didn't riot. Actually, scratch that, it was the exact opposite of a riot. With ice, cold calm, and perfect self-control, they simply dispersed the attackers and then spent the entire night singing and dancing to defend the building. Just incredible. Section 3. Estonia's rock anthems. Old traditions meet electric guitars. Now, we really need to talk about the music itself, because this wasn't just, gentle folk humming in a meadow. This movement leveraged serious volume. The young composer Alo Matisen wrote songs that became the undisputed anthems of the revolution. Just imagine being in a massive crowd and suddenly heavy metal electric guitars explode over the loudspeakers. You've got lead singer Ivo Linna belting out these hypnotic, driving verses, and hundreds of thousands of people screaming back, "Guarding the beautiful fatherland, fighting against the enemy, remember, 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 remember." Now, what's really interesting here is the structure beneath that heavy metal sound. These rock anthems utilize something called regilal. It's an incredibly archaic Estonian folk tradition built on an incantation-like 8-syllable meter. So they basically took modern rock and roll and fused it with their oldest indigenous folk structures. They turned an ancient poetic meter into a highly tactical tool for mass unity. It was this exhilarating rush of national revival, all wrapped up in a beat you couldn't ignore.
They also had these massive, soaring, soft rock anthems boldly declaring things like, I am and I'll stay Estonian. I was created Estonian, proud and good to be Estonian, free like our forefathers. Now, underneath those catchy pop rock melodies, these lyrics were doing heavy lifting. They were actively resisting Soviet assimilation. By firmly asserting their indigenous roots, singing these words over and over with their hands in the air, the Estonian people were loudly refusing to be erased.
Section 4. Latvia's Ancient Weapons, Driving Darkness to the Sea. Shifting our focus a bit south to Latvia. The date is July 1988 at the Baltic Folklore Festival in Riga. This specific event is widely considered the official spark of Latvia's singing revolution. It kicked off with this incredibly visceral opening incantation by Helmi Stalt. She chanted, "Shine, sun, shimmering, drive darkness to the sea." As Latvian folklorist Dana Stultz explained it, these songs weren't just cute cultural artifacts for them. Living through the grim years of Soviet occupation, Latvians viewed these songs, this ancestral wisdom, as their literal weapons to fight off the darkness of assimilation. And the stakes here? They were absolutely astronomical. It forces us to ask a pretty chilling question. What actually happens when a culture goes extinct? Because for the Baltic states, this wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. It was a terrifying, immediate threat. Just to show you how seriously they took this threat of extinction, at that same 1988 festival, the musicologist Valdis Muktupavels and the Rasa Ensemble performed a song reconstructed entirely in Old Prussian. Now, Old Prussian is a language that literally died out in the 17th century, gone. Imagine hearing the eerie, harmonic throat singing of a dead language washing over that crowd. It was a stark, living reminder of what happens when a smaller folk is crushed by a bigger power. It woke people up and made them fiercely protective of their ancestry. And get this, even when the Latvians revived old military tunes, the vibe was totally different. Listen to this translation. Our troops are not so great in number, but feel our spirit, great and free. Notice how it's not about aggressive conquest. It's not about marching into someone else's land and wiping them out. It relied entirely on spirit, honor, and defensive resilience.
Section 5. The power of nonviolence, defeating an empire.
So the crucial point is how this unprecedented cultural effort actually managed to do the impossible. First off, it united incredibly diverse political forces around one single goal. They used song to maintain their non-Soviet identities, basically throwing a shield around their inner culture. But the most mind-blowing part? From January to August of 1991, even when Soviet soldiers deployed lethal violent force in the streets, the Baltic states held their ground non-violently. They flat-out refused to escalate into armed warfare, and that insane discipline is what ultimately won them full diplomatic independence. And this strategy definitely wasn't just invented overnight. Take a look at this quote from the 19th century Latvian poet Auseklis. "The power of songs drove away war." This exact poem had passed into their national choral canon and actually resurfaced over a century later at the 1990 Song Festival. It just brilliantly illustrates how deep the historical roots of this nonviolent identity really ran. For them, nonviolence and national identity were exactly the same thing. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought today. If a bloodless-shinning revolution was able to completely defeat a global superpower, where else in the modern world could cultural heritage be weaponized for peace? What other seemingly impossible conflicts out there might be solved not with barricades and weapons, but with the unbreakable unity of a shared song? It's a pretty profound reminder of what the human spirit is capable of. Thank you so much for joining me on today's Explainer, and keep learning.